Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be talking about the F1 2021 ratings by Codemasters. As you may have seen on this channel before, I already made a video about these ratings and giving my own opinions on them and what I'd change. That being said, I didn't really give it much thought. It was very in the heat of the moment and very rushed. So I decided to take a step back over the last few days, give it more thought, and found a much more methodical approach for how I think Codemasters should have approached this topic. Assigning ratings to drivers is never easy. It's quite a subjective topic, and people are always bound to have their own opinions, thus causing lots of division within the F1 community. After going through all kinds of aspects, I decided to take a look at how I thought Codemasters approached it, made some changes, and have come up with this new remastered version of fixing the F1 2021 driver ratings. Before we dive into the ratings themselves, I'm going to go through my methodology and my definitions of the individual stats because they are different to what Codemasters' official game actually is. I'm not a fan of the system they employed. I feel their stats they're using are quite vague and they didn't really go into much depth when defining their own individual stats and how they're calculated and how the overall rating is also calculated. As you can see, I've defined pace as a measure of the driver's speed, and it was based on lap time data from qualifying and the races since the start of the turbo hybrid era. Racecraft is defined as a measure of a driver's ability to pull off overtakes and to defend his position. It's based on my observations of all the drivers since the start of the turbo hybrid era, and of course, it's my personal opinion. I replaced awareness with a stat called management. It's a measure of the driver's ability to manage their tyres throughout a race. It was made from a combination of lap time data from the past 7 years in the turbo hybrid era and also my own personal opinion. Lastly, replacing experience is form. It's a measure of the driver's consistency during the 2021 season only. In-game, this acts as a multiplier for the 3 stats mentioned above to reflect the ongoing 2021 season without affecting a driver's overall or potential ability when performing at their very best. For me, this was the absolute best compromise to get a good balance between drivers performing well in 2021 and drivers who we know are very good but are slightly out of form, like Daniel Ricciardo. This form stat wouldn't prevent Ricciardo from ever reaching his best. It would just mean that when the form stat is lower, he will not reach his best level that often, like is happening right now, but we all know he's capable, so it's a win-win for everyone. All icon drivers in my hypothetical game have this stat set by default to 95 to ensure they are always consistently operating at a very high, near perfect level, thus actually being a good boost to your team. The overall rating is a weighted average of all the individual stats. Pace and form have a 30% weighting. Racecraft and management have a 20% weighting. Now, how did I decide who gets what individual stat? Well, it was along the lines of me ranking where I thought each driver was from 1st to 20th in each individual category. For example, as we can see, this is how I ranked each driver in terms of pace. As I already mentioned, it's based off the past 7 years, so the entirety of the turbo hybrid era. I looked at their qualifying pace against their teammates, their race pace against their teammates in clear air, and how they sort of compare with other teammates, and I came up with this final ranking. I did the same for racecraft and management, although it was much more difficult to get any meaningful data as there's not much to fall back on anyway. So these rankings are more my personal gut feeling from what I've seen over the years. Of course, this is all my opinion. I'm not passing any of this off as fact, so if you disagree with me, please let me know in the comments in a respectful manner. As much as I hate to say it, we do live in a community and in a time where there's lots of toxicity. So being respectful and having interesting, engaging debates with fellow fans is the least we can do. Finally, for the form, it's using a similar logic. It's not just measuring the amount of mistakes a driver has made, but also how often I think they pull together good qualifying laps, how many times they reach the potential of where their cars should be in the races, etc, etc. Overall, I did find a good balance was reached in including 2021 form and an entire driver's career. Of course, using 9 races isn't enough to fully rank all the drivers, so we had to keep in mind what each driver's potential or overall ability actually is versus how they're doing now. So in that sense, I think I found a good compromise in getting a good balance between 2021 and overall career. Without further ado, let's dive into a bit more detail explaining how I rate each driver individually and also see how the new cards would look with the new names of the stats and the new ratings. Where better to start than Mercedes? Hamilton's weighted overall rating is 96, whereas Bottas's drops down to an 88. I gave Hamilton 94 form and Bottas 87. Hamilton was only ranked behind Verstappen in this category, as I believe those two have been the best drivers this season. Whilst Lewis has made some little unforced errors, like in Baku and Imola, I still think on the balance of things he's gotten the absolute most out of his Mercedes this year, bearing the circumstances. As for Bottas, he hasn't been bad this year, but I've seen him drive better. When I look at his qualifying gaps to Lewis, his race gaps to Lewis, and where he is in the championship, I think Valtteri is capable of more, but he's very close to a very high level anyway, so 87 is a fair rating for this stat. Now for racecraft, I've given Hamilton 95 and Bottas 85. Hamilton again is only ranked behind Max in this category, and it might surprise a few people, but I'll explain. I defined racecraft purely as the ability to go for overtakes and defend their position. Like I said, it was very hard to judge, but this version of Lewis we've seen in the turbo hybrid era has mellowed quite a lot. He's not a bad overtaker. I still think he is the best wheel-to-wheel racer on the grid, but as I've said before, it has to mirror what happens in-game and in real life, it needs to match up. Hamilton isn't likely to go for that banzai overtake or be too aggressive in his defense anymore, so that needs to be reflected in-game. We all know he's capable. I have confidence in him whenever he does go for a move, but I feel Max Verstappen is more likely to do it, thus he has a higher rating, with a similar success rate. So in other words, think of it as a combination of the ability to pull off the move and their aggression in going for moves. As for Bottas, 85 is a solid rating, but it's not his strength as a driver and never has been. I do find Valtteri strong in other areas. He's quite cautious when going for moves. He can make them stick if he wants to, as we've seen at Williams, but again, as I've said, he doesn't go for those banzai overtakes. He prefers to pick up those points and be a bit more consistent, help the team out in the championship, and that's why I've given him an 85 as to anything higher. On to management. Hamilton simply is the best in the business now, on the tyres, managing the race, his race IQ, his experience. I've given him the top stat in this category, 98. Bottas, 88, is still a very good stat to have. It's better than most of the grid, apart from those drivers with lots of pedigree, the Hamiltons, the Alonsos, the Vettels. So yeah, 88 for Bottas, 98 for Lewis. As for the pace stat, both Mercedes drivers get very high ratings for this one. Hamilton 98 is the highest out of all of the drivers. Bottas 92 is top 5 or 6 on the grid in my opinion. This stat, the pace stat, was the most data driven of them all, and in the end Hamilton did come out as the fastest driver in my data analysis. I managed to find a way to negate car performance by looking at various ways drivers performed against their teammates pace wise, and yeah, that's how it ended up. Hamilton was the quickest, Bottas was in the top 5 or 6 on the grid, so very good stats for both Mercedes drivers. Moving on to Red Bull, Verstappen keeps his 95 rating and Perez now gets a 90 rating. I think Perez was criminally underrated on the actual F1 game, and I think 90 suits his ability much more. There's a reason Red Bull signed him and are looking to sign him for next year. He's currently third in the championship, Max is currently leading, so it all makes sense. Verstappen gets 95 form. I think he's been the outright best driver in 2021. He's been so consistent, hasn't made as many big mistakes as some of his competitors, and is leading the championship in Red Bull, doing exactly what he said he would if he was given the car, so looks promising for Max and the Orange Army. I gave Checo an 88 for form because I do think there's another level he can get to. He's not fully up to speed yet, we must remember that at Red Bull. He's still mastering the Red Bull car, getting more used to the team because he was in Racing Point for 7 years. So that adjustment he's had to make has probably been bigger than anyone's. So Checo 88, solid, but could be better in my opinion. Both drivers scored very well in racecraft. I gave Max the highest, and Perez was also very high up on the list. The reason I gave Max the highest is not that I think he's better at wheel-to-wheel racing than Lewis, but he's more aggressive and that needs to be reflected in game. Hamilton does hold back a little bit more, as I've already said, and Max does really go for those moves whenever he's presented with the opportunity, and giving a higher score logically should enable Max in the game, in the hypothetical game, to go for those moves more often and reflect real life much better. Management again, Perez scored very highly here. He's known for his tyre management, his race management. It's where his big strength lies and it's why Red Bull signed him. Christian Horner even said recently Perez's tyre management is second to none on the grid. So I've given him a 96, only behind Hamilton and Fernando Alonso for obvious reasons. And Max gets a 93, which is also a very good rating for someone his age. He is quite experienced, but he's never really had an experienced benchmark for a long period of time in his team, apart from Ricciardo, but he was still finding his feet. He was still a teenager back then. So he's had to really find his own way in the sport, so it's still quite impressive what he's managed to achieve. Max scored 97 for pace, the second best on the grid, and Perez 89. Again, solid on the grid, one of the best. So where Max lacked to Lewis was in the qualifying, but I guess we can just put it down to approach and experience. Hamilton has been a qualifying master for so many years, so that should be expected, whereas Max is yet to have that pedigree in qualifying, if you like. That's where the little difference came down to. When it came to race pace, they were nip and tuck, which is always promising for Max. Perez 89 pace, his race pace is very, very good, but I don't think it's quite at the level of a Max or a Lewis or a Charles. So yeah, that's where the difference lies in the Red Bull camp. Ferrari got shafted by Codemasters. I guess that's common opinion now. I still haven't found a valid reason as to why they're so low, but it's just wrong. And my ratings have Leclerc as a 93, Sainz as a 90. I gave Leclerc 90 form, Sainz 91 form. That really came down to the final 4-5 races where I think Sainz has been the better performer at Ferrari. I also think Charles hasn't been at his very, very best this season. I do think the magic Leclerc we saw last season is yet to be fully unleashed. Sainz has been exceptional, by far the best of all the new drivers at new teams this season. He's impressed me so much. He's right up there with one of my drivers for the season so far. I gave Leclerc 93 racecraft, Sainz 91 racecraft. Again, not that Leclerc is any better at physically overtaking or defending, but just it comes down to the aggression. Leclerc's always going for moves, defending every position whilst not losing time. He's spectacular to watch, and thus I've given him 93 for racecraft, behind Hamilton, Verstappen and Alonso. Sainz is also up there, I believe in the top 5 or 6 on my rankings for wheel-to-wheel racing. It's always been one of his big strengths, his lap ones, his cleanliness in racecraft. Really took him to the next level at McLaren and has made him the driver he is today. Management, I've given Sainz a higher score than Leclerc. I guess it comes down to experience. It was a weakness Leclerc had in 2019 against Vettel. This season as well, Sainz seems to have the upper hand when it comes to managing the tyres. So yeah, something Leclerc is always improving at. He made a big step in 2020 according to both himself and Pirelli, so that's promising on his side. As for pace, Leclerc's ranked number 3, Sainz also up there, but not quite in that elite crop, only at 87 compared to Leclerc 96. Where Leclerc does lack to Lewis and Max is in the race pace, whereas he's more than a match for them in qualifying, maybe even ahead, but I had to strike the right balance between quali and race pace. But he still came out as number 3 on my list, which is always good. Now, McLaren. This will be the final team I cover in this part of the episode, so getting into it, Norris 89, Ricciardo 90. There's no way you can put Lando above Daniel, no matter what has happened so far this season. Daniel drops his rating due to the form, whereas Lando has 93 form, the third best on the grid behind Max and Lewis, because that's how exceptional he's been. He has great racecraft, but I've given Daniel a higher score, mainly due to his experience and all the sublime overtakes we've seen from him at Red Bull. Even at Toro Rosso and Renault, his racecraft was impeccable. Management again comes down to experience mainly. Daniel's always been very strong on his tyres. Daniel last year and the year before that at Renault really had the upper hand on his teammates in tyre management. Even a guy like Hülkenberg, who was even more experienced than Daniel. So Daniel really excels in this area. But why I've given him such a high rating is because of 2014 and his time against Max. That's where he did have a little bit of an edge on those two, especially Vettel. I cast my mind back to a race in Monza 2014 where this skill was displayed at its very finest. He was able to go really long on his first set of tyres without losing any pace, and this is a trait I've seen in Daniel over many years. Daniel's able to go longer on his tyres than most drivers on the grid without losing pace, which is a very difficult trait to have and very rare to see in F1, and only a few handful of drivers possess this. As for pace as well, I've given him 93 based on my analysis, Norris 86, but let's keep in mind Lando is nowhere near the absolute peak, so this should be expected. Daniel, whilst having these amazing stats, 92, 94, 93, his form rating is one of the lowest on the grid, thus it levels out in-game, hypothetically, to something similar for what we're seeing this year. I've seen Daniel have some good performances this year, such as in Spain. His qualifying lap in Bahrain was very, very impressive, but he just hasn't been there consistently. I know he's capable of it, but we just need to see it on a more consistent basis. As for Lando, I think he's pulling every last inch out of himself, getting the utmost performance from within himself and from his current McLaren. Thus, he has a really high form rating, which should, in theory, boost all the other stats and make them higher than they actually are, again, hypothetically in-game. That's it for part 1 of this video. In part 2, we'll be covering Alfa Romeo, AlphaTauri, Alpine, Aston Martin, Williams and Haas. If you enjoyed the video, please smash the thumbs up and let me know what changes you'd make, or if you have any feedback in the comments below. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It will really help us grow and it would be much appreciated. Thanks for watching, and until part 2, see you later.